Hi everyone, welcome to Doing Sociology's platform. Today we have a very special guest with us, Professor Manali Desai, and we also have Pratichi Majumdar with us, who is a PhD student in CSSS JNU. Her PhD thesis is titled Storytelling on the Internet, a sociological study of popular English and Hindi web series. And she's also currently working with the ESRC funded Gen V project, Urban Transformations and Gender Violence in India and South Africa, which is based at the University of Cambridge and the Institute of Economic Growth. We welcome both our guests to Doing Sociology. Doing Sociology, as you by now know, is a blog which is women-led, completely independent and non-funded. And we are looking at making sociology accessible to each and every one of you, and hope you enjoy our upcoming interview. I would like Pratichi to take over and introduce our main guest today. So over to you, Pratichi.
Hello. Professor Manali Desai is a reader and a fellow of the Newnham College in the University of Cambridge. In 2020, she assumed chair as the head of the Department of Sociology, the first woman of color to lead a Cambridge department. Dr. Manali Desai received her PhD in sociology from the University of California, Los Angeles, where she trained as a comparative and historical sociologist. Her work encompasses the areas of parties and political articulation, social movements, ethnic and gendered violence, and post-colonial studies. Her current research, which is funded by the ESRC, is a comparative qualitative project titled The Gendered Violence and Urban Transformation in India and South Africa. It is such a pleasure to have you here today, ma'am.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
To start with, we'll begin with the question and answers. Ma'am, you've spoken about the relationship between gendered violence and India's body politic following the December 2012 rape case. In recent years, we have seen many more cases where sexual abuse of women, particularly from the marginalized sections of society, has grabbed almost a spectacle-like interest among the masses. How do we understand this in the context of the present political climate in the country?
That's a wonderful question, Pratichi. The thing is that one of the interesting things for me about sexual violence in India and gendered violence more generally, as we're talking about it in our project, is that there is such a long history of gendered violence in not only in our country, of course, in many other cases, but here, speaking of India, the founding moment of India was, in the context of the partition, marked by massive amounts of sexual violence, which actually it was an untold story for a very long time until historians came along and really looked at the archive and found nothing really, very little of that being documented, had to painstakingly put together these stories of how women face gendered violence and sexual violence on their bodies in all sorts of ways. And for me, starting with that moment, what is really interesting throughout the history of India is the disavowal of violence. So the way in which actually violence is so pervasive that it's actually not talked about, that it becomes a silent kind of truth that is there are multiple cultural ways in which we disavow it. We look away. I've said this in some written. Our eyes are turned away from it, and I don't mean by us. I don't mean all of us, but I think more generally, I'm speaking for the public. So it is not surprising to me that when for example, after the 2012 rape case, when there were so many protests and women started to speak up about, women have spoken about it for a very long time, but when there was this kind of mass upheaval, that the disavowal turned this into a kind of spectacle. So it now becomes a thing to be talked about as if it's not about us, but it is happening elsewhere. So, for example, you said, how is this happening in the context of the present political climate in the country? I think what is happening in the present political climate is that sexual violence is is more so than ever before. It's happening in so many parts of society, but it is attributed to others. Whether it is marginalized sections of the population, whether it is laboring men, whether it is Muslims. So it's this disavowal, this putting it onto somebody else that really interests me as a cultural phenomenon. What is specific to the ways in which we as a nation do this disavowal? That's for me a really interesting question.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Desai. My question is sort of uh, related to the more, to the current context of the COVID-19. And, with the announcement of the lockdowns, there were several reports from many different places of rising domestic violence and abuse cases. So, how do such scenarios pose newer questions for those working on gender issues?
Well, I mean, again, my view on this is that what is the COVID lockdowns have shown us is this way in which the home was in a way always hived off from the way we talk about politics. So we talk about politics as something that happens in the public sphere. We talk about violence as well as something that's open, that's a spectacle. And I myself have written more about events and spectacles than I have about these silent forms. But it really became apparent to me that the home is a site that has been as yet not sufficiently integrated in the way that we talk about the body politic. I mean, I'm going back to some earlier writings on the home and the nation. It was so important for nationalists to think about how the home now fits into this new nation. Is it the site of the spiritual? Is it the site which is the preserve of what is the kind of purer Indian nation? Or, what is it? Now, what is the home in the contemporary period is a fascinating question. Women are increasingly questioning traditional gender boundaries. They're questioning their sort of location in the home. And what kinds of anxieties is that bringing about? So I would like very much, is actually in the context of our project, our ESRC project, as well as to raise some new questions about the home, the site of the home, and what do we do when we render things as private, and what do we do when we render things as public? What is this division that we have taken for granted theoretically, analytically, culturally? Is that useful for us, anymore? And so I don't have a sort of a pat answer for you about what newer questions, but I do think that that it is going to take us in some new directions in terms of sort of integrating the home. And for me also, what this means is that something that has really kind of animated the project itself is the theoretical and methodological boundaries when people talk about gendered violence. We were really concerned at the outset with the way in which public health or criminology or different disciplinary projects have hived off different aspects of violence. So what we call IPV, or interpersonal violence, has been located in specific literatures. And we're taking these literatures out of their silos and putting them together to see what we can learn by doing that. So we really decided for this project as well to really focus on the home. And it was not something that was something that we had thought about pre-COVID, but actually the COVID scenario has really brought that in sharp relief for us, the importance of actually bringing the studies of, say, so-called IPV, or domestic violence. What is domestic about the domestic? What is domestic about the private? What's private about the domestic? Just asking those questions would be, I think, very, very, very interesting for feminists in general, and for us in the Indian context.
Right. Thank you for that answer. Because the project focuses on the urban, so my next question is again, connected to that. So you see, in the backdrop of rapid urbanization and neoliberal changes in India, how can one understand transformations in masculinities and femininities and their relationships? If you could throw some light on this.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very big question and a very important question, because there isn't one straight answer to this, I mean, even the term neoliberal, I think, is very tricky because what exactly does it mean? Are we talking about a form of capitalism? Are we talking about new cultural forms? Are we talking about neoliberalism the way that it's manifested in the West in terms of kind of individual responsibilization, etc.? I mean, I think in India, what we're seeing in the last, let's say, 2 decades, since the early 1990s, is a mixture of things, where the liberalization and urbanization, liberalization of the economy and the kind of urbanization context of that has brought about some clashes between those who would like to hold on to something that was before, and including the forms of disavowal that were implicit in that, and then that includes people of a more liberal persuasion. I'm not just talking about Hindu nationalists, but, others as well, versus, new social movements, I think, that are sort of queer liberation, social movements, Dalit movements, that are really trying to kind of completely overturn those assumptions and ask some very, very basic questions about the setup of modern India, the hierarchies, and especially, like, I think the questions from Dalit feminists have been very, very important for posing those kinds of questions for us. So, I mean, what is happening in India is what one would call a maelstrom of these different things in the mix that are creating a very potent, actually, environment, where kind of an increasingly more right-wing Hindu nationalism, with its media technologies, with its kind of very sophisticated kind of IT cells, etc., are creating a very dangerous backlash against these liberatory movements, And I think that's where the violence is happening. It's located because the backlash is extremely powerful, and anyone who has been subject to that, knows what that really is, So traditional masculinities and femininities don't, in my view, are increasingly being eroded, but I think they're not being eroded in the way that they're not being eroded in a singular way. It's not just an old story about women reclaiming the streets and reclaiming new identities and challenging conventional norms, gender norms. But I think also in there is this potent, very toxic mix of the backlash, which I think will have all sorts of effects that need to be understood,
Right. Professor Desai, you have not just worked on gender, you've also looked at party politics in India. And since you mentioned, movements and Dalit feminists, so how do you think that concepts like class formation and class struggle can help us understand the situation or party politics in India?
Well, very good question. I mean, I think basically, one of the interesting questions for me, when I looked at the question of class in India way back when I wrote my PhD, was really to ask, what does that concept actually mean in a context or in a case where there are so many other hierarchies and forms of power operating, I was particularly really interested in the caste question, because across India, there are so many configurations of what one might call caste and class, and there are obviously huge debates about it. For me, the question was whether, in terms of a challenge to the forms of capitalism that had been developing in India, whether a class analytic was necessary, and I think it is. I would stick by that very strongly, because I think in the absence of a class analytic, you lose the sharp focus on the kind of political economy of capitalism. Having said that, I agree that that it's not just in India. One has to ask these questions about race and class in other formations too, or other ethnic categories, and gender and class. So I wouldn't be the first person to say this. I think one needs to think about class in terms of its intersectional connections to other categories. But for me, still the class analytic is absolutely vital, and I would absolutely stick with that. And I feel very dismayed when I see political analyses trying to move away from that, because I think when we do that, we are really losing sight of the connections between the situations of people who are marginalized under the context, in the context of the contemporary political economy of capitalism in India. So I'm happy for these things to be, and I think these things should be debated. I think also you asked me about party politics. I mean, I think that obviously, at the moment in India, you have this idea that if it's not the BJP, then what is it? Is it Congress? There are these are the two alternatives. Neither of them has any kind of, Congress doesn't have a class analytic. Congress is a catch-all for multiple groups, and in fact wants to compete very much on the same terrain that the BJP does in many instances. So in fact, the Congress is caught up in its own contradictions about what kind of party it wants to be. So I have written with other colleagues as well about this articulation concept that, there needs to be, I'm not saying it has to be this party or that party, CPM, whatever it could be. It has to be a party form that would push a class analytic in the Indian context to connect up with sectors, Dalit, women, marginalized groups, working classes in their hybridity, but really to push for that kind of an articulation.
Thank you, ma'am. Just following up with that, ma'am, a lot of your work is extensively on party politics and political participation, particularly in Bengal and Kerala. How do you think that over the years, in the last, say, a couple of the last couple of years or the last decade or so, how do you think the meaning of political participation itself has evolved in India?
Well, there's an ongoing dissatisfaction, obviously, in the last several decades with parties, and so new social movements try to organize outside of parties, and we've seen very many of these very, very successful, powerful social movements. Inevitably, the social movements come up against this point or this barrier of what do you do without representation, and it's a long debate, but there is this issue of how do you push for meaningful social change, legal reform, reforms to working practices, etc., etc. How do you push for that? How do you push for reform of capitalism without representation? And I think that's why this question of having a sort of an agent that is a party, essentially, in the Gramscian sense, that would operate at multiple levels, that would be able to connect sort of the parliamentary and the non-parliamentary. Otherwise, what you do is you're always fighting outside the system. And I'm not convinced that that is very productive in the long run. So you really need a discussion about when you say what is the meaning of political participation, how has it changed? I think I can understand the kind of disillusionment with parties. Parties have become a site of corruption, they've become a site of misogyny, they're a site of many problematic things. And for a long time, many theorists have talked about parties as these oligarchical kind of organizations that appropriate power. But does that mean that that is the only way that a party should be constructed? Is that the only way that a political organization should be constructed? Is oligarchy the only way, that the only destiny for a political organization that seeks representation? I don't think so. And I think there would be enough people who would agree with me. But of course, the million rupee question is, how do you create such an organization? What would that look like? And can we reform existing parties, or do we need to create new parties?
Right. Since we're talking about parties, there have also been sort of weak party articulations, and you've discussed how they contribute to India's low rate of development, particularly in the post-liberalization era. So, how do you see this, taking shape in the present political scenario?
I mean, India, what is also seen as sort of India's strength, which is this multi-party system, at least when we're speaking at the state level, there are so many different political parties, and Dalits have their own political parties, many different organizations have their own political parties. Um, it can also contribute to an enormous political fragmentation. And this fragmentation means that every election, it's up for grabs which combination of parties is going to win power, whether they can actually see through a longer term program of reform, can they even reach agreement. And I think this is also the Achilles heel of India's political fragmentation, which is that fragmentation after a point can be a means for a lack of any kind of longer term reform. And I think if you look back however many decades in India, well, really the Congress had held power from 2000 to 2009. Am I correct? 2000, 2004, 2004 to 2000, something like that. Yeah. And there was a sense there that perhaps there were some ideas about what kinds of programs can be undertaken, but even that proved to be quite unstable, and the BJP has actually managed to capture that fragmentation, take advantage of the vacuum created by the fragmentation, and so actually the BJP is this stable articulation for now. And that's the dangers, I think, of fragmentation, is that it can be taken up by a party that seizes the opportunity to create a kind of, a friend-enemy type of distinction and rule on the basis of that, rather than on the basis of kind of a longer-term social transformation that is developmental. So yeah, so that's basically my worry about the current political scenario. But I think this has been a worry that's been developing now for well over a decade, if not more.
That's very interesting. Now, to ask a slightly different question, you've also spoken about the post-colonial turn in sociology in the context of Indian nationalism, and emphasized the need to connect the analysis to colonial histories and representative politics. Could you slightly elaborate on this a little? And what would the decolonization of sociology then mean in the context of this sort of understanding?
Yeah, I mean, I think this question is referring to something I wrote about in the context of this, what does it mean to decolonize knowledge? What does it mean to decolonize history? When we don't actually look at the centrality of nationalism, so my concern is really whether we can speak about a colonial and post-colonial dichotomy without central attention to nationalism. And the reason I say that is because it is very easy to kind of seek a kind of move away from the colonial, something that Hindu nationalists have done very effectively. So I've actually looked at some examples of that in this blog that I wrote. They've done this very effectively. I mean, where the West gets turned into the kind of, polluting force that has really, turned our attention away from more ancient forms of knowledge and practices, entirely sidestepping the question of how this knowledge of the ancient past or authentic cultural practices is completely Hinduized. So we need to take our own kind of our own cultural kind of colonialisms, internal colonialisms, if you will. And I think people will be shocked if I say this, but I think we need to take those seriously in our understanding of what post-colonial means. So this there can be no return to some kind of pre-colonial past in our understanding of the present in any innocent way. And no one could tell me that and convince me of that, because the filter is our own construction of what this pre-colonial past was. And the filter is nationalism, and the filter is this understanding of what is we, us, about which the past is to be written, right? So that was really the point I was trying to make there. And so I talked about this analytical bifurcation between the colonial and the post-colonial, and the West and the East, which is lethal, because it just allows someone to come and talk about kind of spirituality and authenticity and the origins of, and ancient practices in a way that will appear on the surface of it to be post-colonial and decolonizing, but is actually not. So, we have talked a lot about in our department here. We are very concerned with this question of decolonization, and by that we really mean a questioning of the analytical primacy of Western texts and Western theorists like Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and so forth. And I think that there's a very productive discussion to be had in India about Indian sociology. The ways in which we might want to supersede the Western construction of the discipline. But I think we would have to be very, very attentive to the filter that I was talking about, through which this discussion might happen if we're not careful.
Right. So, we've come towards the end of this interview, and we're from the Doing Sociology blog team. We're extremely, glad to have you on our platform. And thank you so much, ma'am, for taking time out from your busy schedule to do this interview with us. And we would also like to thank Pratichi, who's again taken time out to, be part of this interview. And thank you to both of you. And we really look forward to reading more from your project, the ongoing project, whenever the papers are out. So thank you again. And I'm sure our viewers will be learning a lot from this conversation that we've just had.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I'm a fan of your blog, and I really do follow it because I follow you on Twitter, and I think you're doing an amazing job. I would like to actually